Okay, everyone, I think we're going to start the panel now. So I'll just begin by introducing everyone. So on my far right we have Sophie, who is the national organiser of the Free Speech Champions Student Network. She's a student at Cambridge and she's been featured on GB News. To my closer left we have Pete, who was the founder of LTD, been involved with the SU and our kind of speaker controversies a number of times, and spoken to Parliament regarding free speech at universities. On my left we have Raquel, who's a writer, campaigner and researcher from the Dominican Republic. She specialises in ending male violence against women and girls and is currently pursuing a PhD at Bristol. And on my far left we have Oscar, who's currently a student, spoken with GB News and at the Battle of Ideas. So this panel just generally is about free speech on campus, how we as students can deal with issues surrounding students' unions, universities and institutions, lecturers, and kind of creating a general culture of free speech, and one that doesn't create echo chambers that the universities have kind of been labelled with nowadays, and instead advocates kind of coming together for discourse and a diversity of opinion. So without further ado, I think we'll start with Sophie.
Okay, thanks Matthew. I think it's been great watching the panel, the first panel, and then also being in the workshops, seeing how much of a focus there is, not only on what the problems are, but what exactly we should do about them. And you know, the blurb of this panel asked us to think about how we can reconstruct civic discourse. And I kind of wanted to go back a bit and kind of note that plenty of people, both in academia and in politics, will deny that there is a problem with civic discourse. It doesn't, it's not broken and it doesn't need fixing. I recently heard an academic argue that a statistic from a report at KCL, which was that 25% of students who were surveyed said that they were afraid to express their views. This academic, someone I respect, is a philosopher, and who teaches at my university, argued that actually the statistic is proof that free speech on campuses is alive and well, because the reason that these 25% of students are afraid to express their views is just that they know that their peers are quite happy to exercise their own right to free speech by ridiculing them and criticising them and making moral judgments about them. And I defend the right of those other students to do that, of course, but personally I don't think it's desirable to have a university environment where we have this outcome that people are using this really emotive language that they're genuinely afraid to express their views. And we see similar arguments specifically in discussions of no platforming, both sort of in the media but also in academic literature. There's a number of philosophers, Amiya Srinivasan, Priyamvada Gopal, Neil Levi, Robert Post and Victor Tadros, who more or less say the same thing. Free speech, but not free speech without consequences. And I think because this is such a widely held view, we do actually have to address it really seriously. We have to give it serious consideration. But I'm not going to come at it directly, because I think I'd be preaching to the choir for one thing, and for the other, I kind of want to get back to this question of what we do about the problem, rather than the question of whether there is one. But I do nevertheless think that there's probably something to be learned from looking at the assumptions that underpin those arguments, and that's something we can then apply to how we address the problem. So, I mean, that's a single statistic, it's a piece of information, and yet there are radically different ways of interpreting it. And I think it seems reasonable to think that these radically different interpretations of the statistic might stem from really different starting points about what free speech is, and also what its value is. So I don't want to straw man anyone here, but I do think that we have to kind of dig into that a little bit, because I do think that there's some insight to be gained. And in terms of what free speech is and when protection should apply, I think we're in the situation where some people understand free speech as just being about the law. And we've touched on this in the first panel. It's kind of, how should we address this? Should we address the law or should we address the culture? And as I say, I think that's underpinned by a lot of people who would argue that as long as the state isn't intervening to punish people, as long as no one's afraid of being imprisoned or killed, it doesn't matter if an academic loses their job, and it doesn't really matter if a student never has the chance to kind of refine their views by putting them out there in a public space. Yeah, is this argument that we're all familiar with, free speech but not free speech without consequences. And on the second point about what the value of free speech is, I think that many people believe that free speech advocates value free speech because they want to use it to say horrible things. That's the impression I had as a student at Cambridge, first kind of digging into this and realising that there were people who would genuinely explicitly say to me that they didn't believe in free speech or that free speech was a right-wing dog whistle. This idea that free speech is an excuse to bully and harass is just it's just a completely different way of looking at the world. And I think if we're going to persuade anyone or get anything across to them, we have to understand where this other side of things is coming from. And I think I want to say that if we want to defend free speech, we have to give a positive account of why. We can't just point to the problems with it. We can't just look at these individual cases, like Kathleen Stock, like Stephen Greer, like Neil Finn, and use that as our sole argument, as much as it is important and as much as it is emotive. I think we have to, if we actually stand a chance of convincing anyone, we have to go a bit further. We have to explain why it should matter to them as students. And I think most students do just want to get on with their degrees. They want to go to the pub and make friends and get a good degree at the end of it, hopefully. And many students are also really politically engaged, of course, but ultimately we have to frame it in terms of what we can offer them as well as the responsibilities they have. So I think my best attempt at this it goes something like this. It's the idea that free speech isn't just the right to speak, it's the right to hear, and it's the right to be challenged. And all of these cliches that we're all kind of tired of hearing, I'm tired of saying, it's the right to be exposed to opinions that might make us prickly, but ultimately that force us to grow. And I think Arif touched on this earlier actually. That's something that doesn't just matter to, as a student, it's something that matters to being a human being, being a person in the world. And as naive and as idealistic as all this might sound, I do believe that this still appeals to most people on some level. We just kind of have to find a way of framing it properly so that people understand that that is where we're coming from. And I suppose to end, I'd like to throw that out to all of you. I mean, what is a positive account of free speech? How do we defend free speech in a way that isn't just X bad things happen when we don't have it? And I really hope we get into that a little bit in the discussion. Thanks.
Cool. If you'd like to go next.
Sure. Firstly, before beginning, I'd like to extend my appreciation to free speech champions and, of course, my sort of home with Liberate the Debate. It's incredibly heartwarming to see, namely with LTD, that still coming from strength to strength over the last 5 years. I really enjoyed the workshop as well with Pammy Landy, Adam, Will, was Gabriel, excuse me, Gabriel on the ancillary. Now, I think the overall impression here is that all of us have an honest intellectual intent to learn and engage with content. There's no sense here that there's anything that's facetious. I think we all have a good purpose in what we're trying to do this. So what I wanted to focus on, because it was a very open question on how can we debate together, so perhaps mine might be slightly more practical or prescriptive. And when I thought about the word debate and what it meant over the last 5 years, I sort of sat there and thought, okay, what comes up? And I thought of slightly cringe-inducing names since 2016, such as Shapiro, Stephen Crowder, or phrases such as libs destroyed or vouch or social media and political debate, or even more bluntly when we talk about parliamentary debate or something where the continuous purpose is to beat the other person to win. And it was almost sort of Ciceronian in a way, as a sort of practice of sophistry. And I think, at least as a practice of freedom of speech, when we have an honest attempt, I think that sometimes it slightly poisoned the well in what we're trying to achieve. And the primary thing that strikes me here is that when we take the phrase, which I'm sure many of you will roll your eyes to, is the sort of facts, not feelings. And sometimes it feels like one of the primary components that we've forgotten with is that whoever we engage with, they are still a person, and whatever political beliefs they have a fundamental emotional basing underneath that. So suddenly turning around and ripping this whole argument, even if they had an infantile or weaker argument or something, it's preposterously rude to tear it up and push them off and expect that it's a good job well done. And I would like to present, at least, that for many people here who want to debate, to consider who you're talking to and what is a realistic or pragmatic outcome, especially for us when we're at university and whatever your political views, you are against the grain. And I don't think, instead of saying we need to fight the whole culture, at least in the short term, consider the environment around you. So I'd like to ask the audience to consider a few scenarios. Firstly, a time when you've been debating an individual, you've presented all the points as best as you can, and the other person has, let's say, they don't have a leg to stand on at that point. But they're not conceding, they're not giving up, and you're just thinking, why aren't they giving up? Or something, and it can be marginally frustrating, or they're refusing to yield. So consider that scenario, and then also I want you to consider when you've been on the other side of it, when someone with their intellectual prowess on another side has just got you, and you're sitting there and you're just thinking, I don't want to give it to this person, I don't want to let them have it. Now, the next part is I'll also ask about a time when you've been talking about a political debate, when you have, let's say, rolled over the other person or whatever, but they've actually conceded, and they said, yeah, you're right, or I'm going to think about that. This is far more poignant. And I would propose the question that with these memories, who do you think was the most mature in doing this? Where was strength of character? And I would propose that the person who said, yeah, you're right, or I'm going to think about this more, is the person that gets the medal on this one. And if anything, is someone who's really seriously practicing a lot of the core of freedom of speech. Moving away from John Stuart Mill arguments or anything, he's someone who's, or they, are an individual who has a set of beliefs, which is something that they built over time, it's become part of their identity, personally, emotionally, politically, and they've opened themselves up and said, actually, I'm willing to reevaluate that. And that's a personal journey or an element of reflection that considers quite a strong level of strength, and something that I think we should respect. And so moving away from YouTube or the larger debates in terms of winning, just to focus on this. And so the things that I want to underline is you can't magically overturn someone's political view. It means a lot more to them. There's a lot more values tied to it. It's not just a trinket that you pick out of a library and then you go, yeah, okay, I'll return that. And if you were choosing to overturn someone on a major argument or something, then, kind of like the inverse of the phrase of Rome wasn't built in a day, just think about what you can reasonably do. Think of yourself almost as a salesman. So, no one's going to come into a shop and say, buy my stuff immediately. They're obviously going to do something in the meantime to try and profile you, see what they're going to try and do and what they're going to try and achieve. Because they're realistic. They want a good outcome, rather than just buy your stuff and then you get scared off and leave. And so what I would ask is that I would say that you would get a lot more progress asking people why they believe what they believe. What are their foundations? Get a hold of what the person understands. Understand their backstory before you're just going to the sheer facts and logic. And then after that, once you know what that person's about and where they understand, I would argue you have a far more pragmatic discussion, and ultimately you are practicing free speech with far more context in that particular scenario. And this is one side in terms of talking about the, let's say, the attacker or the person who wants to overturn. But I want to give credit to the person who might be on, let's say, the defensive or the lesser point. And as I said earlier, I think that they are the more important individual in this because they've shown more intellectual strength or character on their part to be willing to open themselves and to seriously consider their fundamental beliefs. And I'd ask you yourself, have you been in a situation where you've been in a debate with someone, you've felt wrong, and you've made the decision, as much as it's difficult to yourself, to go, I'm going to reconsider? These can be obvious points, they're not difficult, but I think emotionally they're difficult things to do. And at least while I was within Liberate the Debate, one of my number one priorities when I debated people was always not to go with, you know, just let the facts do the talking. You've got to understand the person who you're talking to. Because if you're talking to someone who's a sort of traditional Catholic and suddenly you're an atheist or something, it's not like you're going to turn them over and they're going to go, gee whiz, I've thrown everything I've believed in over the last 2 decades. You know, and similarly, if you were talking to someone who was an anarchist or something, you are looking at a lot of foundations here, and you've got to think, okay, what is a productive conversation, and frame it and look at what you can do. And I think that's an element of maturity that we can all look to and practice to, and I think if we are to be serious free speech advocates, I think every time you talk to someone, you need to consider these things. They can be nuanced, but just over the last few years, after popular media and the way that the title of debate has been stamped, I can only define it as, the well has been poisoned. And I personally like to say that all of us should practice more nuance and care and empathy when we go forward. That's all.
Awesome.
Some great points. Raquel?
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be reading some of my speech. So first of all, I want to thank the Liberate the Debate Student Society, the Free Speech Champions, for hosting this Sussex Free Speech Symposium. And I also want to thank particularly the organizers who are students who are here, because they have been so thoughtful and helpful in organizing this conversation, which is so desperately needed in academia. So out of propriety, I have to thank the University of Sussex and the Sussex Union, Sussex University Student Union. Unfortunately, both institutions are probably the reason why we're here today. And I think that we're here today because we can notice that things are not right in academia when it comes to conversations about free speech or to debate about political issues and public policy issues. And I think that there has always been rowdy student activism. There has always been tensions on campus. I mean, my parents met a student activist back in the Dominican Republic, and my mom tells this very, it's not charming, this very kind of story about how the police, they were protesting the state, and the state was very violent and all that kind of stuff. So my dad was sort of holding a door, and the police was throwing like tear gas at them, and that's how he introduced himself to my mom. Like, she wanted to leave, and he was like, "Hi, here's my name," like that kind of stuff. It was kind of creepy. But yeah, so my parents are student activists. All these are generations before us. They have engaged in student activism, but I think that there's an element which perhaps may be related to social media and how it dehumanizes people. You don't see them as people. You see them as avatars. You see them as a username in a social platform. There may be an element to that, and how that's poisoning academia, I think. And I think that the line between political disagreements, which is perfectly acceptable, which has happened all the time, I think the line between political disagreements and abuse has been crossed. It appears to me to be something that has been crossed, and I think that the fact that there's a philosophy professor named Kathleen Stock who was hounded out of campus because bullies and harassers couldn't phantom a woman with an opinion that they deem unacceptable, I think that that's something that should give everyone pause. And I think that instead of reminding those protesters there is a line between free speech and abuse, the University of Sussex, what they did is that they allowed this hostile climate to foster. And I mean, the experiences of women like Carly Stock and me is different because I'm an immigrant, you know, I don't have really a context here in this country. But to think that even for a woman who is like, she has support around her, she has a career of decades-long career, and she couldn't she couldn't bear that, you know, she just couldn't continue on. Like, the fact that it got to that level is something that should give everyone pause. I just want to say that those same protesters threatened to dissent on this event as well, and you can see that we're just a group of people who want to have a chat about something important. I have also been informed that the Sussex University Student Union, they have some sort of system where they monitor the speakers' views and they flag me because of my views. So senior staff had to be consulted before I was approved. And you can see me. Like, all I am is just a student, like all of you. And I'm just a student who doesn't want to just sit in a classroom and absorb information like a sponge. I'm a student who, like all of you, want to be politically active, want to be engaged and be a part of the democratic process. And I suspect that the views that may have raised alarm at the Sussex University Student Union are my views in defense of everyone's sex-based rights. And I argue that sex is immutable, that it is a biological reality that affects the differentiated ways that everyone's bodies process medicine and manifest illnesses and diseases. That is science. I argue that public policy regarding prisons, regarding refugees, regarding changing rooms, and regarding hospitals must be acknowledged. The reality of women and girls in those places must be acknowledged. And I also argue that being a woman is not a feeling. The vast majority of people in this planet agrees with those views, but even if they didn't agree with those views, there should be no controversy around saying that. But this in itself encapsulates the problem that we find ourselves today, which is that here we are, we're a group of people, overwhelmingly students, and we just want to talk about something that is important and sensible. And perhaps disagree, but disagree in a sensible manner. Yet universities and students' unions have been convinced of, or they have taken it upon themselves to think that their role is not just to facilitate conversations and facilitate an environment in which people can have different views, but that they have to have a stake in political issues. That if there is a conflict between two sides, then actually I have to pick a side, you know, whatever the issue is, whether it's sex and gender or Israel and Palestine. It's like Black Lives Matter. They think that in order to connect with people like us, they need to take a position, and they're not thinking about the fact that it's like, well, we're students, but there's a plurality of views among students. They don't have to choose a side. They need to create a space in which debate can be encouraged. But instead of being neutral actors, what they have done is that they have decided to universities and students' union have decided to pander to the loudest voices. For example, in the debate regarding sex-based rights and gender identity policy. So now, how do we disagree fruitfully? And I want to say, like, whoever wrote the little introductions to this debate is such a great writer. It was so beautiful. Like, they wrote, how do we disagree fruitfully? How do we resolve clashing opinions? What are the best ways to constructively disagree with other people? Deliberate the debate, student society wrote. Given genuine intellectual diversity, means opposing claims to truth, how can academics and students collaborate to expand and secure knowledge-based education and open critical inquiry? That's such a great paragraph. Well done. But I wanted to say to you that I think that it depends on what it is that we're trying to achieve. You know, do we want to build personal bridges with people, our friends, our partners, our family, or is this about political campaigning? Do we want to reach out to people who are on the other side of a political debate? And I think that if it's a matter of personal relationship and the people around you, I mean, I think all of us can relate to how painful it is when you find yourself in different sides of a debate with someone that you love, and that just it really tears you apart internally, you know? So that can be so difficult, and I think that the only way that we can sort of rescue or sort of, how do you say, protect those relationships is to remember the things that you have together with those people that are aside from that topic. Like, for example, if it's about trans issues, you know, it's like life doesn't revolve just around that topic. You know, there are many of my friends who probably don't agree, who disagree for any number of reasons. But you know what? There's a lot of things that binds us together that are not just about that. So it's like, if it's about personal relationships, I think that it's important to remember, you know what? There are other commonalities that you share that can make sure that the humane connection between two people, between a group of people, doesn't get severed forever. But then politically, I think that this is about understanding that persuasion will always achieve more than bullying and harassment. You know, a Conservative MP was murdered about a month ago. A few years ago, a Labour MP was also murdered. And they were murdered both because their opponents didn't want to refine their arguments. They didn't want to argue. They wanted to inflict violence. That's it, you know? And instead of using words and intellect, they chose violence and abuse. So I think that something that is very interesting is, for example, in the case of Kathleen Stock, yes, the students who did their thing and had the images plastered on that bridge that you have to go through when you come to campus, and who did that demonstration with the balaclavas, yet they hounded a woman out of campus. You know, they succeeded in making her feel so unwelcome, so uncomfortable that she's not here. But they also achieved something that is unintended, which is that they raised awareness of thousands of people who perhaps will never voice an opinion about it, but they were silently watching, right? So it's like, if your purpose is political campaigning, then that is perhaps the worst strategy that you can have, because that is only going to turn off vast numbers of people, a lot more people than the ones that you can get to your side, because people are not that virulent about political issues. So I just wanted to say that when it comes to, well, how do we disagree? I think we have to make a difference in our minds about, well, is this about a personal relationship that I'm trying to bridge a divide that I have between me and someone else that is in my personal life and I want to reach, or whether this is about broader political aims. And what I would say about broader political aims and political campaigning, that is like, well, actually, persuasion is always the better answer than all the alternatives that have been presented. But in order to do that, you have to sort of come back to that little bit that I mentioned when it comes to personal relationships, which is about like remembering the compassion and the commonalities that you can have, like Peter was saying, like the commonalities that you could have with the other person that you're trying to convince in this political issue, that you're trying to sort of bridge a divide with. So yeah, that's my input. Thank you.
I'd just like to give Alice the credit for those statements you read out. I don't think LTD can take any credit for those. But Oscar, if you'd like to go next.
Yeah, I'd like to start by thanking, obviously, Free Speech Champions and LTD as well for putting on a fantastic show. When I read the blurb, my initial reaction was that actually what we need to do as free speech advocates is to actually have a diagnosis, to actually analyse what is going wrong in terms of freedom of speech. And I've really put it down to a few key points which I'm going to go into, and then I'm going to talk a little bit, hopefully not too long, about what I think we can do about it. But I think what's gone wrong is the fact that we've taken a lot of our own personal rights for granted, right? So we take it as a given that we're all in favour of freedom of speech, and most people will say they're in favour of freedom of speech, right? You go out on campus and you ask them directly, are you in favour of freedom of speech? Most people will tell you yes. But what we're lacking as a society is, because we haven't spoken about it for a long time, no one actually knows why they're in favour of freedom of speech, why freedom of speech is important, and these arguments are never had, and especially people like us who want to actually advocate for freedom of speech, we need to actually explain to people why freedom of speech is so valuable, so important, and we actually have to cherish it. Not just tell people, oh well, you know, freedom of speech is good and diversity of ideas is good, because a lot of that can come across to some people as just sort of waffle, instead of actually analysing what the importance of it is. And I put it down myself to the most important thing with freedom of speech is to find truth. I think that's the main thing in terms of freedom of speech. When you're debating with someone or having a conversation with someone, you're trying to figure out what is true, what is categorically true and what is not true. And with freedom of speech and truth, one can't really live without the other, right? So you can't try and seek truth if you don't have freedom of speech. If you can't express yourself clearly, and the other person can't, you can't come to some arrangement, then you'll never find the truth, right? And it goes both ways. So if you don't have truth, or you have no intention of finding truth, which is where I think we're at the moment as a society, we're not actually interested in finding the truth, we're interested more, you know, the old cliches he said in terms of feelings and that type of thing. We're not interested in what is actually categorically true. So then what's happened is free speech has gone out the window, because if you're not trying to find out the truth, then there's no point actually having the conversation in the first place, and you may as well just be nice to each other. So yeah, that's in terms of my analysis there. I also want to touch a little bit on social media, and I think social media has actually played a bad role for freedom of speech. What social media has done is that it's as you can all guess, it brought discussions to tweets and interactions to one-line tweets, and I don't know how many characters in a tweet at the moment, I think it went up, but it's not a lot. And you can't physically see someone and look into their eyes. You can't do tone, you can't see what they're actually thinking, facial expressions, you can't read people, all of those things which actually, as humans, you know, we have to interact, and we can actually get a perspective on whether the person you're talking to is serious, is joking, what they actually think, why they think it. And generally, I think when actually you have that human contact, people are much more empathetic than they are over social media. So, for example, if you're disagreeing with someone in person to person over a coffee, you're much more likely to actually just get along with each other, for example, than if two people disagree over Twitter, right? So I think that's important, and I think social media has played a very bad part in that, and I think actually what we need to do is we need to go back to actually having face-to-face interactions, face-to-face discussions, which is why things like this are so fantastic. The other thing I'll touch on is, I think another problem for freedom of speech is it's linked to tribal politics, and I think that's where we're at the moment in terms of mobs of people think a certain way. And when I say mobs, I'm not just talking about the lunatics who were trying to hounded out Kathleen Stock. I'm talking about mobs as well on the right, in the Tory party and everything, just mob thinking, right? So my example would be with the Conservative Party. The shift of the Conservative Party over the last 10 years has been extraordinary for me. So if you go past the financial crash, when the Conservatives were in power, they started talking about, well, we need to cut everything, we need austerity in order to actually get our finances back in order, because our debt's so big, right? Which is a perfectly reasonable argument, right? I don't necessarily agree with it, but it's a reasonable argument to be had. And a lot of Tories said this at the time. They were just like, this is true, the Conservatives are bang on here. 10 years later, when our debt is 50 times bigger, or so, when our debt's a lot bigger, now they actually want to invest a lot more, and now they want to have more police on the streets and all of this. It's like, well, there's no consistency there. People actually are so ingrained in their own tribe that they actually don't think for themselves. And I think that's a problem with party politics that we've got in the Labour Party, in the Tory Party, in any party, where individuals don't actually think for themselves. You know, for example, with austerity, do I actually believe this is the right course of action or not? And I think you've seen that now more with COVID, for example. I think there's a tendency, or with people on the right as well, to be a bit more like that, to be a lot more tribal than I think they used to. And make no mistake, freedom of speech is having threats from the right as well as the left. It really is. There are people on the right who who want to silence people on their own side for things like masks or in terms of COVID, or mandating vaccines, forcing vaccines. Now, I think it's a horrible idea, but they actually want to sort of stop them speaking and saying, oh, well, they're not right-wing, they're just, you know, they're traitors and all of this type of language. So that's my analysis of it. In terms of, very briefly, what I think we should do about it, I think there's a few things. I think Peter's point was excellent about the ability to admit that when you're wrong, or simply say, I don't know the answer to that, right? So just simply saying you don't know something, I think Peter's right when he says actually shows a lot more maturity. And to me, if someone says that, or I try and do it myself, not always with great success, but when people do that, what it's basically saying is actually that they want to be interested in the subject that they're talking about. They want to find out more, and they're interested in, go back to the beginning, in actually pursuing the truth and trying to find the truth in the discussion. And that's much better to accept that you're wrong or accept that you don't know something than just going back and forth with someone. So that I think is important in terms of what we do right now. But also, going back to the start, just to wrap up, I think the key bit is actually to figure out why we think freedom of speech is important. So the pursuit of truth, the fact that, again, we don't speak about this enough as free speech advocates, but most rights through history have been gained with freedom of speech, right? So freedom of speech should be advocated, you'd think, by the left and by and people on that side of the aisle, but it's simply not. But if we can actually sit down and explain to people why freedom of speech is important and why it is a noble cause, I think you win more people over like that than just sort of shoving free speech down their throat and saying free speech, free speech, free speech. Because I think it's an incredibly noble cause, but I just think we need to adapt it and actually improve our arguments.
Well, thank you for that. So we'll go straight to the floor with that, I think. Does anybody have any questions? No.
Mine's for Oscar. I was going to say, you know, I like your point about we need to remember why we're actually pro free speech in the first place. But just to push you a little bit on that. Like the very point of it, that there isn't one truth and we're all going to end up disagreeing anyway.
I think there is a truth, especially in things like, best example is obviously what's happened here with Kathleen Stock. I mean, there are things that are just undeniable, right, with the thing with Kathleen Stock, which she said, right, like sex exists, right, and that sort of thing is just being covered up as if none of this exists, right, and the truth isn't important. What's important is how you feel. But yeah, I mean, you can interpret truth in different sort of ways. Whether, you know, is there one complete absolute in terms of more science-based, evidence-based, but also in other conversations you can interpret truth as in sort of what works, what doesn't work, what's good, what's bad. There's different ways of doing it, and you can only do that and pursue those goals if you actually engage in discussions and you find flaws in someone else's arguments and the other person finds flaws in your arguments. Yeah.
Thanks, Oscar.
You're looking at me, I was like...
Yeah, I just was making a connection in my mind between academic freedom and freedom of speech, and the connection in my mind is that it's about the internal rigour that is required of you if you assume total responsibility for the ideas that you put into the world. And so as an academic, what you learn to do during the process of, say, undertaking a PhD is that you're brought into the community of scholars and you learn the practices by which you interrogate your own ideas. So it's not actually this kind of external dialogic process, it's actually an internal one. And yes, you engage with the literature that already exists and the scholarship that already exists, but actually primarily you're learning to accept the discomfort of self-interrogation and forcing yourself to be unconvinced by your own previous argument, which is actually, the fun of that is an amazing thing once you accept that that's what you're there to do. And so actually it is primarily an internal experience. And although I agree with Pete in some ways, I think sometimes that there's a simplification that somehow it's about one person, another person, having an argument and then trying to persuade the other person. Actually, persuasion is as much about persuading yourself as it is about persuading that person in front of you. And you may well never persuade that person, but other people hear what you say, you develop your ideas, and they're able to go into the world in a more powerful way, which is important if you think they're right. But you have to accept that self-interrogation process. And that's the buzz of academic life, but it's also the buzz of freedom of speech more generally. And that's why the freedom to hear is so important, because without those external stimuli to your own process of self-interrogation, you lack the sort of the fodder, the kind of meat on which to develop your own thinking.
Yeah, no, definitely. I would guess I would ask the panel then, based on that. So if academics have this responsibility to kind of engage with other ideas and take them on, do we think maybe that students should now be kind of given that responsibility as well? Considering I know the previous panel talked quite a bit about kind of commercialisation and how people are just there for the degree and the qualification. But if we want to make our university and campuses now a lot more kind of pursuit of knowledge and a place where we actually go to discuss ideas and pursue knowledge, should students be held a bit more, perhaps not accountable, but have a greater responsibility placed on them in regards to actually taking on new ideas and learning other things that they maybe don't always want to hear about. Sorry, I was just going to say that. I was going to take one more question, and then.
Sorry. I believe it's Oscar, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned how partisan politics in Parliament leads to a sort of polarisation and confusing people, contradicting what they've earlier said, and things like that, and how this has a negative effect on freedom of speech and just political discourse in general. Would you perhaps suggest that a move towards a more representative voting system, or dismantling the two-party system we have, could that have a cultural effect on our sort of tribalistic culture when it comes to politics? If that makes sense.
We'll start with the second, and then we'll go through everyone. Sophie, did you start?
Yeah, I suppose on your question, I think it's a really interesting one, and it's complex, because I think on the one hand there's a really big difference between the academic role and the student's role, which is that the academic, their job description in a way is to produce knowledge and also to teach students to kind of develop their own ability to engage with ideas and all the rest. And students are there not by any sense in a passive role, but they're not producing knowledge for society. They're learning as individuals. They're kind of learning to engage, and in a way, as much as I want to reject the idea of a university as a sort of business and the student as a customer, the student is going into the institution in order to obtain something or to obtain a service. As much as I hate putting it in that way, and I have quite an idealistic view of universities and what they should do, or just even an old-fashioned or traditional view. I suppose I do want to say, though, that I think students do have a responsibility in the sense that when we go into an institution, we're almost buying into that institution. Like I think there's a sort of implicit acceptance of the rules of engagement within a university life, which involve things like really old established norms, like assuming good faith, like addressing the arguments in academic contexts. And I think it's really unfortunate that the way that university is kind of presented to students now is such that they almost aren't aware of that kind of responsibility, if you agree that one actually exists, if that makes sense.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I think that I really like the comment, and I think that I will have to disagree with you, Sophie, on it, because I think that students produce knowledge. You know, I mean, you are there to learn, but then you're there also to engage and be awakened intellectually, like all that kind of stuff. You know, but it's like I think. Yes, you're learning something, but then so for example, in a class about medicine, that student who just learned about medicine, yes, you got this knowledge, but then when you go out into the labor force, or if you're a social worker and then you go out and you start working with people, if you wanted to work in refuge work and then you are in shelters working with people affected by male violence, all that kind of stuff, you are everything that you have learned translates into a practice and a knowledge in itself, you know. So it's almost like I see it as there are atoms, but then those atoms in the everyday interactions as students, we become producers of knowledge, regardless of what we do in our lives. Like even if, for example, you do a PhD and then you sort of live a very solitary life as a writer, yeah, but when you write, you're producing knowledge that you got from university. I think that perhaps it would help conversations about free speech and the tensions on campus regarding like difference of opinion. I think it would help if students, myself included obviously, if students understood ourselves as part of the knowledge production process. Because sometimes you can see this sort of hierarchy in which, I mean, I'm a PhD student. Perhaps when I was like an undergraduate, I would feel more, like there's an element when you're an undergraduate, there's sort of like, you know, I'm 22 and, you know, I'm having a lot of fun, and there's a lot of very fun elements to it, and you can create this hierarchy or this division that presents you as like, well, you know, I'm only 20, and the professors, like Kathleen Stock, is over there, she's a professor, she has all of this authority, she has all of this power, she has all of this responsibility, and I have this liberty to just sort of have fun. And my vision of having fun is also targeting professors or people in those positions. I think if we understood that, it's like, well, actually, both the professors and the students, we're all in this big pot of knowledge productions, then we would see ourselves as more, I don't want to say like we would take ourselves more seriously, but it would, I think that if those students who targeted Kathleen Stock saw themselves as actually you're producing knowledge when you're doing those kind of harassment, you know, right there, you know, you're showing people that abuse is okay. If that lesson was internalized among students, I think that the outcome would have been different.
Yeah, no, I think you sort of convinced me there. I think especially there's something really appealing about this idea of knowledge produced in collaboration, and also maybe simultaneously in the same way that learning is a collaboration between professor and student. And just to kind of tie it into this, I was just thinking as you said this, that yeah, I think that would maybe solve this problem to an extent of the way that students interact with professors who they disagree with, or the ideas that they disagree with, not by being in dialogue with the professor, but by going elsewhere, because that kind of sense of collaboration is absent for whatever reason. Yeah.
So just continuing on in terms of student responsibility perhaps, and actually I have good news here, the workshop did actually give me a point, so it was useful. And actually I have to credit Luke on this, and namely we spoke about, and I'm sure this has happened to all of us as students, is to come into a seminar of whatever topic it is, and it's dead silent. We're not even talking about freedom of speech here, it's just people just aren't engaging with the content. And I think before we even talk about fundamental freedom of speech stuff, if people aren't willing to talk or too not comfortable with it, and then you have an atmosphere where you don't have it with secondary school, that's for sure. Teachers get annoyed and they say, express your opinion. In fact, I remember getting in trouble once because I didn't speak at one point. Whereas, this is the opposite, where you sit in these 3-hour seminars and people are just dead silent. And it's like, well, how are we meant to have a practice of debate in the first place? Namely, if faculty have been told in a certain way not to push people to express an opinion and sink into it, you know, how can you have a culture of debate at university if you don't even push this in the first place? I also worry for some of these students, because how in the world are they going to be somewhat employable if they can't justify themselves or even argue in their own debate? I hope as free speech advocates we'd be all right. It seems that we can't shut the hell up instead. So, that's one thing I want to say, because that's just, it's not too much of a free speech thing, just on the basis of seminars, and I think students also should be told quite clearly from the get-go, I think, unless you have a very legitimate reason, that there should be an expectation, not a nice to have, but no, when you go into these seminars, you're going to talk and you're going to argue with it, rather than, has anyone got a nice opinion, please? And you know, at least within Liberate the Debate, Liberate the Debate, admittedly, was not entirely meant to be a whole freedom of speech thing. It was literally just because the modules were stale, and we just wanted to talk about the stuff in greater depth with politics. We also just got drunk doing it, and then we and then we cartwheeled into a free speech problem with our first speaker. But yeah, here we are. Okay,
Oscar.
I'll address the PR question. So I'm not in favour of PR personally. Pragmatically, I can see how it could help in some respects, but I mean I'm half Spanish, so Spain have PR, and some of the crap, frankly, governments that come out of Spain, because all it does is it forces coalition between parties, and then they'll break their promises, and then you have election after election after election within the space of 1 year. I think in terms of what I think in terms of what we can do, what we should do, I think the problem at the moment is with the parties is how they select candidates, right? So I like the two-party system. I think the two-party system generally works, but it's just that our two parties are so dreadful because they both because of the selection process. I mean, what they do is they value the candidates based on their loyalty to the party over competence or ideas, right? So in order to be selected for a candidate, in order for the Tory party, for example, to select any of us as a candidate, what they'll look for is that they'll look for people that actually are sort of very, very loyal to the party, right? So I don't think any of us, or probably anyone in this room, could get elected because you probably think for yourself. But in these parties, you don't think for yourself. That's sort of not the idea of how they're built. So the parties are just too centralised, and that basically brings horrendous politicians and very bad politicians. And I think the best way we can do that, combat that, and actually bring electing MPs based on competence and their ideas, as opposed to their loyalty to the party, is by having by breaking up the sort of centralised power, and maybe start to have primaries in constituencies. I know Aaron Bastani, he advocates this, and it's probably one of the few things I think he's absolutely spot on. I think if you have a system where your local people are picking their candidate, right? You have open primaries or closed primaries, doesn't really matter, but they're picking their candidate, right, based on their ideas, what they think, how they act, whatever, their local community, and that's how they pick it, rather than just voting for the party. You'll get a much better variety of politicians. You get who have less loyalty to the party, right, because then they've been directly elected by their constituents, right, so they have less loyalty to the party, and they have a lot more competence and fresher ideas, and you actually end up having a parliament with new ideas and different ideas. I mean, take the House of Lords, for example. The House of Lords, I'm in favour of it. I think if you listen to a debate in the House of Lords, I don't know if you have or not, but it's 10 times better than the debates you get in the House of Commons. And that's purely because the House of Commons, as I said before, the way they pick people is based on how much you can suck up to the people at the top, and not how good you are at your job. Whereas the House of Lords is different; it's more based on competence. So that's what I would do. It's never going to happen, I think. But yeah, that's what I do. I don't like PR.
Great. No, that was really interesting how that tied into your kind of earlier tribalism kind of discussion, and how I think it's kind of a symptom of a wider issue that that you can people don't want to engage in ideas anymore. People kind of follow the crowd, but maybe that's just kind of a thing that we've seen throughout human history. But I think, especially at universities, kind of going back to the university campus topic, students not actually interrogating ideas much anymore, and just kind of following the crowd as we've seen. But I really liked how the discussion kind of came into about how students can be the creators of ideas, and how that's not academics don't have a monopoly on that. And it'd be really interesting to hear what you guys in the audience have to say about that.
I was going to ask, do you think that, to everyone on the panel, do you think the stigma of kind of advocating for free speech and why some people choose to be quiet, as it were, even if they do think certain things, comes more from the student basis of their peers, or more from the institution itself and the organisation through the student union, i.e. vetting speakers when they come, having people flagged? Do you think it comes from the kind of message from the university that these type of people need to be flagged for our attention, therefore you don't want to be one of those people? Or do you think it comes more from the students themselves?
Yeah, so I just wanted to raise a sort of general question. Sophie began this by asking how would we make a positive defence of free speech as a sort of value in itself, and what would be the values that underpin that? And as Jen was saying, in fact, part of what the approach should be to university is in your own mind, is in your willingness to grow as a person and to obtain new knowledge, and the willingness fundamentally to admit that you could be wrong about many things, and to say, that's okay, I can deal with that uncertainty, and I can go and venture out into the unknown and make it, and understand it, and make myself stronger because of that, because I've faced up to that. So, I mean, yeah, the classical here, it was Socrates who said that he's the wisest man in the world because he knew nothing. And I think that courage, that willingness to, and it comes across many of these issues. For instance, the tribalism issue, it takes a lot of courage to say, actually, this is what I think. My political tribe is wrong here, and I'm going to stand up for what I believe. Or it takes courage to stand up for Kathleen Stock, or it takes courage even to admit in a debate that you might be wrong with your friend, because that would mean, at its bottom, the ideas that guide you, the ideology, all of your beliefs that you come to, some of them could be wrong. That's very, very, that's horrible for anyone to entertain that idea, but you become you need that courage to go forward into those ideas, I think, and to really, I think that's the fundamental spirit of freedom of speech.
Great, I think we've got two more, and then we'll probably go to the...
Just on the vein of kind of what students can do, I wanted to ask both Raquel and Sophie kind of how they dealt with the extreme backlash, I think it's fair to say, and kind of what kind of coping mechanisms you have for kind of going against the grain in such a public way.
This is more important than a question. I think maybe part of the problem with the sort of, we talked about like the students sort of like maybe not having much an individual voice and just sort of going what's kind of like either with a cohort or kind of what they know will teachers give them the best mark. I think maybe it's more of a wider issue of the way that teaching has been approached as sort of like a way to sort of just be like, you want to get the best grades, that will get you the best job, rather than actually having a more fundamental education system based on like, growing yourself as an individual, having different ideas, not necessarily like having one that's right or the most popular, but just sort of trying to express yourself as a human being and trying to grow. And maybe it's a more fundamental issue in the way that grades are awarded, and maybe that's worse at university.
Alistair, would you?
Yeah, I think there's been lots of good points made. I'd like to go back to a couple of things that Peter said in his opening remarks. I think they both firstly get what the problem is, just that we're part of the problem, and secondly offer a way out of it. So Peter, you said, you talked about don't let them have it, or let them have it. That idea of I think that idea of them is quite important, because I think one of the big problems just now is that our ideas are far too personalised, and I think it would be good for everyone if we could separate out the person from the idea. It goes back to feminism actually, and that whole idea of the personal being political, and these days the political has been very personal. I think we should, when we're debating, discuss ideas and leave the person out of it, and if we can start to think about criticising the idea rather than the person, then I think we'd all benefit from that. The second thing you mentioned, which I thought was important, was the idea of nuance. And I do think that is particularly key to being able to debate better. Nuance, to me, suggests precision in the way that we talk about things, which I think is very, very important, and an art that to some extent has been lost these days. I mean, we live in an age where everyday sexism is suddenly inflated into misogyny, or racism, which is something quite specific, all of a sudden becomes this grand idea of white privilege. I think in order to debate better, we need to get, all of us, including myself here, need to get much, much better at being precise about what it is that we're debating, and being able to talk about ideas in a much more precise way. And the second aspect of nuance, which I think it at least implies that's quite important, is that we're prepared to judge. And these days, far too often, I think we're very, very judgmental, as in we very easily dismiss people for what they say. But we're actually very, very reluctant to judge ideas, so we hide away a little bit. We talk about the science says as a means of justifying doing something, actually, rather than judging it. We talk about inappropriate behaviour, rather than something being morally right or wrong. So I think making judgments is an important part of making nuanced arguments, and we could all, if we took that away with us, then we'd be much, much better, all much, much better at debate.
Thank you. Should we start with Sophie?
Sure. I'll try and come in briefly on a few of these different questions. I think in terms of, I think your question was about where this comes from, essentially.
Yeah, just whether generally you thought it was the students themselves who believe this, or they believe that they should be quiet because they think the institution wants them to be quiet.
So to be honest, I don't think the institution has a particularly active role in terms of pushing this stuff. I think its role is generally by failing to kind of protect the, you know, or fulfill the responsibilities that they have both to academics and to students. I think the majority of the student body kind of sort of just maybe go along with things, or don't particularly engage with the issue because they've got other stuff going on in their lives, and there's a small vocal minority of people who are very aggressive and ideological about this. And there's also a specific issue with student unions where they're supposed to be representing us, but unfortunately that's where that kind of maybe quite aggressive vocal minority seems to collect for whatever reason. Laurie, yeah, I thought that your point about how uncomfortable it is, and sort of having the courage to risk being wrong. I think that's a really important point, and it ties into what Pete was saying about students being silent in seminars, because that was always what my impression of the reason for that was, is this kind of terror of getting something wrong, even within this environment that's set up specifically with the caveat that you don't know everything in mind, you know, as a student in a seminar room. So yeah, I think that's important too. In terms of Abby's question about the coping with the backlash when you express, in my case, a gender-critical feminist view, I think it's important to kind of be clear about what the backlash actually is and the form it takes, because I don't want to downplay it and I don't want to kind of overinflate it either. For me, it was largely, it was very much peer policing, as the kind of fear that other students had, or the sort of discomfort you could see in their eyes, almost like a sort of physical drawing away at like the sort of almost blasphemous thing that I was not even asserting particularly strongly, but just, you know, questioning. And that in itself is, I think it has a lot of force, especially as a, you know, given that highly social aspect of universities. There were also a couple of incidents, sort of people going through my friends list and telling people not to be friends with me, and, you know, all of this very petty, snipey stuff that actually, there's not an element of physical danger, and yet that social stigma is very strong. And in terms of coping with it, the answer is I initially didn't cope with it very well, to be honest. It's horrible and uncomfortable. But the more that people dug in and behaved badly, the less able I was to square it with myself, to kind of go back on what I'd said. No one had addressed the arguments, and I didn't want to be bullied into sort of backing down. I suppose it's just stubbornness in the end. But ultimately what happens is you through that kind of dissent, you end up meeting other people who are uncomfortable and interested in having the arguments and having the debate. And I still have good friends from who I disagree with from that time, but you find a new sort of, maybe a new peer group, especially as you progress through university and you graduate. The other question, I think, was Alistair's, or the point that you made about discussing ideas as opposed to the person. I think that's really interesting and really central at the moment, because there's this idea of free speech versus hate speech, the idea that if we can distinguish what someone's motivation is, whether they're motivated by genuinely believing what they're saying, even if they're wrong, as opposed to being motivated by this kind of quite, I guess, quite intangible thing of hate or bigotry, then we can curtail the speech of those people and not curtail the speech of others. And I think there's some real dangers in that from a free speech perspective, because I don't think it is possible to always tell with 100% certainty, especially when you have your own sort of, going back to that sort of discomfort of being questioned, having your beliefs questioned. We're very fallible as human beings, and that's why we have norms and rules around free speech and debate, I think. So yeah, I think that's my whirlwind tour of all of your questions. Thanks for asking them.
Just the first part on the institution, I think just to follow a little bit from Sophie, I think from an outsider's perspective, sometimes when you hear the title of Student Union, you almost slightly imagine sort of the Black Gates of Mordor or something like that. You know, this huge thing. To be honest, when you actually end up talking to the administrators who are full-time, they don't care too much about this stuff. They're a lot more sort of professionally driven. I would argue that more than anything else, that you have a lot of the officers who come in into the trustee positions, and in my experience, at least when we had speakers, and at least within a Sussex atmosphere, they were people who typically did not understand what their role as a trustee was, and conflated what their own political views were with what their responsibilities was as a trustee. And we had times with certain speakers where there wasn't a problem, but then they made it a problem. Because then they talked to people, they talked to their friends who liked to protest, and then they said, now it's a safety problem. And so my strategy a lot of the time, and I think they kind of hated me for it, was I didn't email them, I just walked into their offices, I just spoke to them as a person. I was just like, yeah, I really want to work on these things. Because at least they couldn't say that I was a dick. So they could be at least reasonably nice to me. I actually wanted to follow a second thing, which I forgot to mention. There was actually a seminar where there was active debate, and it was by a professor. He's reasonably high status at Sussex, a chap called Paul Taggart, politics professor who wrote a lot on populism. He was the one guy who actually managed to get busy seminars because he would force people to speak, and then people became proactive rather than getting embarrassed. And otherwise, at the back, in terms of talking about ideas, if we could sort of talk almost as a sort of vacuum and separate from the person, that's something I'd always desire and want. And I think, you know, with my closer friends, I believe that you can practice that to a fair extent. Maybe I'm slightly different in terms of my sort of freedom of speech view. At least I think the intention of what I was trying to say was that sometimes I have the feeling that when we approach or go into debates of potentially vociferous disagreement, that acknowledging the other person and their emotional perspective can sometimes be marginally sidelined. But that said, I agree that overall, I think it will always be a desirable goal that the more that we can talk about these ideas in a vacuum as such, the more desirable thing. I think, I know it wasn't directed at me, but in terms of the sort of coping with backlash, I think all of us probably had some form of various severity, and I'm not going to claim to have a significant extent. I think all of us who are going to be interested in free speech have good intentions, and they want to talk to people with the best will in the world. There are people who will not reciprocate that, or will be fundamentally bad faith from the get-go. And this is the other side of what I didn't include in the beginning of my thing, is pick who you're going to bother to talk to, because sometimes if you're going to be in a situation where someone's already going to have a negative impression from you, there are people who are not going to be willing to be persuaded,
And even if you try and say, I too am a human and I like human things, they will choose not to agree with that. And that was a harder thing for me, because initially I was like, I wanted to persuade people who gave me a problem, you know, and it did impact me for a while, but there are just people, you know, that will not be open to it, and you just kind of have to deal with it. You know, there's 25,000 students, so at least at Sussex, and you have to work with that.
I think I would like to combine some of the questions together, and one of the questions was about where is this coming from? Is it coming from the students, these pressures to side on political matters, or is it coming from administrators or academics? I think that the vast majority of university staff members, from what I can understand, I think they just want to get on with their job. Like if you're an administrator, or if you're a professor, or in any field, I think that the vast majority of them are not into the controversial sort of frenzies, you know, they just want to get on with whatever it is that they are passionate about, their field, you know. But I think that, from what I can understand, I think that what's happening is that people in key decision-making roles, they feel compelled by a very vocal minority, or they decide, as I mentioned, they decide to take it upon themselves as like, oh, well, actually, I need to make a statement about Black Lives Matter. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but it's like, that is a decision that someone made. You know what, we need to make a statement about Black Lives Matter, but we don't need to make a statement about the little boy Arthur that was murdered recently. You know, it's like, who makes those calls? Who decides I need to virtue signal about this issue, but not about this other issue? So I think that I mean, decision makers in university positions, they're people, and they're just as liable to become passionate about an issue, angry about an issue, vindictive about an issue as any of us. You know, like I look, for example, at the University of Bristol, and when I went into campus, it was kind of remarkable that in their forms they would ask for people's sex, you know, so an accurate thing, you know, you would ask for sex. But then as trans activism became more heated and heated on campus, you look at their forms now and there's no mention of sex. Now they only want to know about your gender identity and how do you self-identify and all that kind of stuff. Like, those are active decisions that people are making, which are not, they don't fall from the sky. There's people behind it, and there's people with political motives behind it, you know. And I don't think it's like, oh, there's this secret lobby that is doing all of these things. I think that there's people who confuse the lines between, these are my personal opinions and these are the things that are required that I should do because of my job. And I mean, I'm kind of biased, but I think that in some institutions, their preferences veer into blurring the lines with the law, you know. And I think that when it comes to the question of like, well, I think it was like, how did this manifest it in your life, and then how did you cope with it? I think based on my own personal experience, what I did is that on January 2018, almost 4 years ago, I agreed to share a meeting, like Matthew here, you know, I agreed to share a meeting about women's rights, and it wasn't like I am signing my name to like become involved in this controversial stuff. No, I just wanted to share a meeting. I didn't even know these women, and then things just happened, you know. Things happened outside of my control. I had just arrived to campus. I think I started my program on January 12th, and then the bullying started on like January 25th. Like it was like that, you know, and I had just gotten to the country. And then after that, when I saw it all sort of playing out, I was like, my conviction has always been, but I haven't done anything wrong. I'm not doing anything wrong, I'm just having these conversations. My PhD is supposed to be in social policies, like, so this is a social policy issue, I'm just doing what I'm supposed to be doing. And I didn't want to modify my behavior to adapt or to placate the mob, you know. So I just carried on having more events, writing more articles, having more conversations. Like I just carried on living my life, but the hostility wouldn't stop, and it was like if I went to Wales, the same protesters from Bristol University would target me as well. If I went to Oxford, they would go to Oxford. If I went to Bath, they'd go to Bath. It was like, and it happened periodically on campus, outside of campus. I don't want to go into a long rant about it. But what I want to say is that I just carried on living my life because I've always sustained. I haven't done anything wrong, and I'm not doing anything wrong. It is not me, the person that has to sort of adjust my behavior. And in the course of here I am trying to live my life as a human being, I got into this dance with the University of Bristol in which they were like looking at their policies and what is bullying and harassment and what is free speech and what is this. They got into this dance, and eventually they decided that they made a decision that I disagree with, and then I said, well, actually a university cannot have policies saying the targeting of people is unacceptable except when it happens to Raquel. And I decided to sue them, and I'm suing them. And we're going to go to court in February. Okay, so, but the point that I'm trying to make is, it wasn't like in January, I had like this little notepad, and I was like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to get into a 4-year battle with this university, and it's gonna like take us to court, and I'm gonna do all these things. It wasn't that, it was just, I'm living my life, having conversations, exercising the rights that I have. And it has felt like I am battling people or situations that want to sort of permeate this, permeate my life, you know. So how have I coped? I haven't. The PhD is going very, very badly. It has taken a massive toll in my academic. It has taken a specific toll in my academic performance. Because when you experience all of these things inside of an institution that you still have a relationship with, it is extremely difficult for you to continue to engage. But I've sort of like Sophie, like just sort of, I have planted myself like a tree and said, I have not done a single thing wrong. So I'm not gonna resign, you know, and I'm not gonna quit. But it is challenging. It just is.
I'll start with the one about the students and the universities. I think yes, in some respects, universities need to do better. But I think what's more worrying isn't necessarily whether or not you can have someone sort of speak, although obviously that's a major concern. It's just the culture with younger people on freedom of speech, which is really frightening. So yes, universities can do more. But even if you get to a stage where the students want to, which does happen, students want to block someone from coming and the university overrules them, right? Yes, that's a win in terms of, you get the speaker there and ultimately freedom of speech prevails. But, there's still a hell of a lot of people that are trying to cancel someone. There's still a hell of a lot of people that, are trying to rule by mob mentality. And that's not a good thing. That's really the culture shift. The culture is a thing that we actually need to handle. Individually and sort of as a collective, and until the culture shifts, I'm not sure that the universities necessarily are going to shift. I mean, you could do it top down, so you could have sort of institutions from the government and the university sort of enforcing freedom of speech. But I think it's preferable and better to try and do it bottom up, to try and go from the bottom with individual people and try and win them over. And it ties into what I said at the beginning about how we're going to deal with it, and how individually and as a sort of, as a group, how to actually win people over. And it's one of those things, I think, freedom of speech, which is so easy, or it should be easy to win over people on the left or liberals, right? I'll call them. It should be the easiest thing in the world to try and convince them about, because these people think they are in some sort of noble cause with what they're doing. They're cancelling someone, and they're doing it in the name of liberty, right? That's really what they're doing. They're doing it in the name of safety, in the name of the freedom for someone who's trans not to have caffeine stock, whatever. But actually, if you flip the argument and you actually show that what liberty is, liberty and freedom is the ability to say things, right? And you actually make the argument to that. I think that's a lot more powerful than what they've got. But I just think that actually we need to actually decide why we're in favour of freedom of speech, and go home and while you're having a pint in the pub or something, just think about why like freedom of speech is important to you. Like, what's the actual concrete thing? If someone asked you, why do you want freedom of speech, and why, or as opposed to not having freedom of speech, think categorically, what are the benefits of it, what are the reasons for it, what are the consequences if you don't have it? And those are the sorts of things that you actually need to be persuading people with, not as opposed to what happens a lot, which is just like, oh, we're in favour of freedom of speech, which means we're good. Well, okay, yeah, well, that's true, but like, you're not going to convince anyone with that. You've actually got to explain it to them and explain nuances of it, as Alice said. And another important point that was made slightly earlier about admitting you're wrong. Admitting you're wrong is important, right? It's majorly important if you're in a discussion and you think you're wrong, admit it. But by the same token, don't admit you're wrong when you're not wrong. You don't think you're wrong, just don't give in. Don't try and sort of comfort these people. And I have a lot of admiration for the stories that I've heard here on panel in terms of digging yourself in and just saying no. Because that's what they ultimately don't want or don't like or can't handle. They want these mobs want people to cave or to apologise or to crumble, or they want their sort of lives ruined. And if you just deny them that opportunity by just outright saying no, then I think that's the best way. And in some respects, can be the most admirable way of dealing with it in terms of just planting your feet and just saying that you're not going to move. And yet, the point that you made earlier in terms of how to deal with it. Again, I think Peter said earlier, everyone, I think, in this panel has had some sort of thing to deal with. The way to deal with it, I think, is just try and ignore it as much as possible. And by ignore it, I mean literally ignore it. So, for example, Twitter, right? So a lot of people get a lot of abuse on Twitter. I've always found that so dealing with Twitter is a lot easier. Because you just get, once you send out a tweet, and if it's controversial, right, you'll get on your notifications, some of you, a lot of you will know, notifications, you get like 20 plus notifications, right, and you scroll. Just don't do it. Simply don't read them, and don't reply. So I'm on Twitter, and when I send out a tweet, and someone comes back to me, and they don't do it in good faith, I just don't bother reading it or don't bother replying it. I just leave it there and ignore them. And that will wind them up much more than if you bite. Just do not bite. And the other thing to say on that is yeah, like I've had it, and I'm sure a lot of people in this panel, I think Sophie spoke about it earlier. You have your loads of friends that will leave you, or will start criticising you, or will tell other your friends to stop talking to you, etc., etc. But frankly, that's not the biggest issue in the world. I mean, if your friend's doing that, they're not really friends. So that's their loss, not yours. So I wouldn't worry about that. And actually, what you learn is if you do speak out, the people that then surround you, and you surround yourself with, are a lot better and mostly more fun as well than the other people that would otherwise try and get you cancelled. I think that's most of the points. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, great. That's fine. Well, I think we'd like a big round of applause. Brilliant. So, thank you everyone for coming down today. It was great to see so many of you here. There's the new Taboo magazine, which everyone from the Free Speech Champions, which everyone should grab a copy of.
Please take them, because otherwise I've got to carry them back.
And if you could all pass somebody in a white hoodie with your name badges, that would be great. And then we're all headed down to Falmer Bar.
Yeah.